Very, very happy to join you all today. I think that my topic is a little bit unusual for what the ASCMS has seen before, so I'm hoping that you can all learn something new about the fashion industry today, and how I'll share what I've learned. So as Daniela mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit more about what I've learned both in the fashion and retail industry, as well as what I've learned since I've started Public Habit in the last couple of years. A bit more about me, just I don't want to spend too long here. I know Daniela gave you a bit of background about how I came here, but I have spent most of my career in e-commerce and brick and mortar retail between Amazon and Ralph Lauren, which are two very, very, very different retailers. So I saw two very different sides of the coin, but still a lot of similarities in terms of how we're thinking about the fashion supply chain, which really hasn't changed in a very, very long time. I've also spent over 6 years at this point living and working in China, with about 5 of those years focused on textile sourcing and apparel sourcing, specifically in China. She studied Chinese at university, so I'm quite proficient in Mandarin. And if COVID were not a thing this year, I would be back in China, which is my home. But I am currently in Seattle, Washington, which is kind of my first home, I guess. So I have spent the last couple of years as the co-founder of Public Habit, as Daniela mentioned, an on-demand fashion e-commerce platform that is on a mission to really rethink the fashion supply chain to minimize waste and do good for the planet. What have I learned in the last 10 plus years? So I'm sure you're all very familiar with fashion, we all wear it, but you probably maybe aren't as familiar with how slow and linear this supply chain is. And even working in the industry, it took me a while to figure out just how broken it was. So it's a very slow, linear system that is trying to serve a digital customer today. And it hasn't worked for a long time, and it's even less effective and efficient today in a digital age. So it can take anywhere from 12 to 18 months to commercialize a new fashion product. These long lead times are creating a tremendous amount of inefficiencies along the way, especially creating a tremendous amount of waste at the end of this very linear chain. Overproduction is a huge problem in the industry, and I'll dig into some of the impacts of overproduction. And I think it's one of the most untold sides of the story when we think about the unsustainability or the negative impact of fashion on the planet. Typical brands are having to guess what customers want at least 12 months in advance, and as you can imagine, they guess wrong, they make too much of the wrong thing, and that's creating a lot of problems for both the bottom line and our planet. So how bad is it really? It's pretty bad. So it's estimated that 30% of garments made are never even sold. So I'll let that sink in a little bit. That means almost 1 in 3 garments produced, brand new garments, tagged, labeled, everything, will never find a customer. No one wanted it. It ends up on the sale rack. It ends up getting ultimately liquidated and typically will end up in landfills. And that's over 50 billion garments a year that are never even sold. And even further into that, it's estimated that 85% of textiles produced in a year end up in landfills. So that does include what we own, what we buy, and what we ultimately give away, throw away, dispose of. It's an incredibly disposable industry. This idea of take, make, waste is really rampant in the industry, and we're owning our garments for less and less time, throwing them away because they're getting cheaper and cheaper while we use them for less long. So there's the ugliest side of fashion is really, in my opinion, this waste and this overproduction that doesn't typically get as much airtime. Brands and retailers have famously been burning tons of unsold inventory and clothing every year to effectively protect their brand image. You may have seen the Burberry news back in 2017, where they'd famously burned almost $40 million worth of unsold clothing just to really protect the brand image and this idea of scarcity of luxury goods. And then you'll see public companies like H&M that will showcase that they have $4.3 billion worth of unsold inventory also in 2017. You can imagine how much worse some of these problems are in 2020, when no one was predicting a global pandemic and you have a tremendous amount of unsold inventory at the wrong time when customers don't need it. So how exactly did we get here? I'm going to just back up a little bit and explain a little bit about what happened in the last 100 years in the fashion industry on the supply chain side to get us into this really bad predicament. So about 100 years ago, the textile industry was effectively a locally produced, locally consumed industry. What was made in the USA was consumed in the USA. Same for Europe, same for Asia. And then somewhere around the 1950s and 60s, as global trade really started transforming the global economy, so did the textile industry move. So it started moving to the lowest cost sourcing regions where you'd find the lowest cost labor, and ultimately this lowest cost high volume sourcing has been basically the breaking of the industry. We continue to push further and further afield from China in most of the 60s, 70s, 80s, even through the 90s, further afield to Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, India, into places where people are earning barely enough to feed themselves on. And there's really a tremendous social impact of kind of how this lowest cost, high volume sourcing has continued to move on. I mean, the fact that we're able to now buy a t-shirt from a fast fashion retailer that's effectively cheaper than a can of soup doesn't make sense. So this high volume, low cost sourcing is not just bad for the environment, it's also really a problem for profitability. And this is another part of the conversation that really needs to get more time in the light. So if you think about it, all of this overproduction ultimately is declining and eroding margins. So in the fashion industry, you start with a product that maybe has a gross margin somewhere between 60 to 80%, and that will decline anywhere into the single digits in net margin once you account for things like storage, transportation, tariffs, liquidations, markdowns. It is a tremendously risky and inefficient process. So this lead time, as we've been talking about, requires that brands and businesses effectively guess what customers are going to want 6 to 12 months in advance. That means they guess wrong often. Hence, when you see a sale rack anywhere, that's often not deliberate. That is just because they had to make more than they needed. And it's estimated that there's over $200 billion of lost value from what we call inventory distortion in the fashion industry. So that's your overstocks and these opportunities of missed sales, having too much of the wrong thing and not enough of the right thing when you need it. If you think about it, you've probably seen fashion shows or seen news about runway shows that often happen at least a year in advance of when a customer will weigh in. That's just a nice little indication of how off this fashion calendar is from where customers are. And I don't need to kind of go into the details again, as I'd mentioned about the environmental impact, it is huge. A couple of other kind of staggering stats that really, really were impossible to unlearn once I learned about them. We've got over 100 million tons of textile waste produced each year. The textile industry produces over 1 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually, and that's actually more than the entire international transportation and maritime industries combined. It's a pretty bad apple, and it really, really is overdue for some significant change. So how do we fix it? So you may have seen, as I have in the last 10 years, a lot more dialogue around sustainability in the fashion industry. It's very exciting. The last 10 years has seen more of a shift in consumer appetite and interest for where their clothes are coming from, who made them. They want to support businesses and brands that align with their personal values. You would have seen this shift happening in the food industry, for example, as you moved to organic or locally grown or pesticide-free, etc. And that shift is slowly happening in the fashion industry as consumers become a little bit more aware of where their clothes came from, what it's made out of, and the impact on the planet. However, I would say that, and there actually are some very interesting things happening on that side. You probably would have seen things like material innovation as we move away from plastics to recycled materials. There's a lot happening in rental or resale. There's a lot of these new models that are looking to try and get more use out of our products, which is great. Extending the lifeline of our products is huge. But I would say that the most fundamental and impactful thing that needs to happen in the fashion supply chain is to shift the first mile, the first step of the supply chain, to be demand-driven instead of supply-driven. We need to bring design, sourcing, fitting, sales, and production into a single digital platform-based flow. We need to integrate all of these elements, and we need to make nothing until the customer wants it. We need to reduce overproduction, so we can minimize waste. We need to reduce return rates by getting our sizing more accurate before production. And we really need to reduce these upfront investments that are really risky in inventory and fabric or finished goods. So I'll kind of dive into these a little bit more and what we're doing at Public Habit to tackle these. But effectively, this long chain, where I envision it going, is something that is entirely demand-driven. And where it starts is identifying really mutually beneficial supplier relationships. So we have to rethink this supplier relationship from being something so transactional to being something much more mutually beneficial and long-term minded. So what do we do at Public Habit? We are really embracing a low to no inventory model, so we can keep our cash where our sales are. We basically produce only after we've received a customer order, and we turn around a customer order from when we receive it to when we deliver it in under 4 weeks. All of our production is currently happening overseas in China, which is still an opportunity for us, but we're still able to run on a no inventory model with production that turns around within 7 to 9 days and then delivers directly to the customer from the source. The most important element that we found in building out this model is to really find the right partners, the right supplier partners who envision a world the same way that we do, who are investing in the manufacturing capabilities. So that means the automated knitting machines that we need to be able to produce one piece at a time. We need an MOQ of 1, no more MOQs of 10,000. This operation only works if we can get to a place where we've enabled really ultimate flexibility on our supply chain. And that requires rethinking that entire supplier relationship. What are they looking for? What are we looking for? And rethinking our payment structure. So we operate on a mutually incentivized basis with our suppliers. So we effectively share revenue with our suppliers, and we share any inventory risk or fabric risk as we think about building out the business and growing. It's a completely different way of thinking about a traditional buyer-supplier transaction, and it takes a lot of work to build those relationships, but ultimately what we've lost in time by building those relationships, we've really gained back in profitability and sustainability. So where do we want to take Public Habit from here? As I've mentioned, I think that there's a really big opportunity on the first part of the design operation to move towards digital design and sampling. there's a tremendous amount of waste before a product has even been finalized in a typical fashion supply chain. It can often take up to 6 months to produce these products before the brands even decide what they ultimately want to make. And it's estimated there's upwards of 15% of material waste that will happen just in the design development phase, just cutting the patterns, getting it right, and ultimately will end up on the cutting room floor. So if you're using 10,000 yards of fabric, at least 1,000 yards of that are destined for landfills in the form of cutting waste. So you extrapolate that plus all of the overproduction, and you've got this additional wastage just from the design and development stage. So the other aspect of this that we're excited about is obviously, and in the age of COVID, this has almost been forced to the forefront anyway, is how do we reduce travel and this time in the development processes to have a more digitally enabled development process. So there are tools that we can use now that are starting to become a little bit more commercially viable that will really enable us to have an integrated virtual design platform with our suppliers. And there's companies like Vor that we've been working with at Public Habit that really enable a virtual showroom and for us to customize our specs exactly as we need to, and for our suppliers to have total access to exactly the same access as what we do on our side. And so again, this transparency between supplier and buyer is really critical. They have to have the same access to the same tools, the same access to the same data for us to ultimately get to these final outcomes. What's next from virtual design? So this will take a little bit longer, but this is another aspect of the supply chain that we are very excited about at Public Habit. As we think about how we could localize production hubs for our global customers. We have an e-commerce platform that can service customers globally, but today we're very localized by where our production is, who is capable of producing low to no MOQ products in a timely fashion at a premium quality. And that is super limited today, but our vision is that we will be able to localize our production for our local customers, wherever they may be. Our customer in Turkey will be able to purchase from our localized hubs in Portugal, for example. Our customer in Virginia, USA, can purchase from our South Carolina production hub. Same for the customer in Hong Kong, purchasing from our factories in Ningbo, for example. And it doesn't require a huge supply chain or a huge supplier network to enable this kind of localized supply chain. It just requires the digital platform to be able to sync all of this data from a fit and production standpoint and a material availability standpoint to know exactly what's where and when, and to produce it in real time. We're a long way from there, as I'd mentioned, as we think about where labor costs are, where material costs are, where material availability is, and most importantly, where some of the manufacturing capabilities are still behind in terms of moving to a more nimble, agile, on-demand production capability. But we see a ton of potential for this, and the impact from a carbon footprint standpoint is pretty incredible. We did some work with a third party to kind of try and understand the difference between a domestically produced product produced on demand versus an internationally produced high volume, low cost not on demand product. And we found that the domestically produced on demand product would generate less than 1% of the CO2 emissions of the internationally produced product produced at scale. That has really big implications. And a lot of that is a combination of the lack of overproduction and producing what we need, but also the carbon footprint of the transportation, which is huge. So what can you do and what can And how can we start incorporating some of this mindset into our different industries and businesses? We think that the most fundamental thing that we need to rethink is moving away from this lowest cost, high volume sourcing model and embracing a low to no inventory model. There is inherently just too much risk embedded in a linear supply chain that is supply driven, like how the fashion industry has operated for the last 100 years. And we need to move away from that and to stop thinking about gross margin at the beginning of the day as being the ultimate metric that we're trying to optimize for, because it gets eroded so quickly through all of these other issues along the supply chain. And then the other thing that we would really, really emphasize are these supplier relationships. These have been so transactional and one note as long as I've been in the industry. And we really need to rethink how we can make these more mutually beneficial and to think about the larger impact of what those relationships could mean. Instead of farming out our bids to 25 factories just to get the lowest offer, we really need to think about who are the right partners who are thinking about the world in the same way and are investing in the capabilities that we need to move to a more sustainable, nimble, and agile production model. And then for us, because we're a B2C company, the other really important element about what we're building is the education aspect on the consumer side. So if you are a B2C business and you're trying to figure out how to make this worthwhile for your customer, you have to bring the customer along your journey, these changes that you'll need to make fundamentally, being transparent about what you are able to do and what you aren't able to do. Where do you still have gaps? We still need poly bags to ship our products from A to B. We still are putting a lot of our products on airplanes, which is terrible for the environment, but it still ultimately outweighed when we did the economics of producing in bulk. But when we're upfront and transparent with our customers about these decisions that we're having to make as we go through this, they're learning, they're understanding, and we're ultimately bringing them along a realistic journey of how this works versus kind of hiding behind what has been a very, very closed and very complex industry. So I'll just close with this quote about what we need. Incremental material changes are not what the world needs. The world needs us to completely upend the way that we do things, to change the whole process and model, and to forget what's been done before. We are really here to completely rethink the fashion supply chain for better. There's a lot of things we can do. This is in our control. It just takes a lot of work and creativity, but most importantly, collaboration across the supply chain. So I'll kind of leave it there and say thank you very much for letting me speak with you this morning, and hopefully I can answer some questions if you have any.